I want to do tonight is finish up, the structure of the book, and this is very interesting to my mind. I've known this for a long time, but I didn't really share it. The first 1 through 89 is both the preface and the introduction. 1 through 72 being the preface, 73 through 89 of the phenomenology. We've read that. We read it fairly carefully, in the last fall. We spent considerable time on this. Hegel once again wrote this after he finished the phenomenology, after Napoleon had arrived in Jena. And, he said the world spirit had appeared on horseback, and that was the image under which he wrote the preface. And it was kind of a recapitulation of everything in the phenomenology, right? So the introduction was intended as a, advanced notice on what Wissenschaften, science of knowing, and the science of knowing the structure of consciousness and the experience of consciousness was about. So 73 through 89 were basically about the structure of consciousness and this kind of crucial word in German, and this should be taken seriously, Wissenschaften, which really is an active knowing process, much different than the word science, from which we get from the verb sciere in the Latin. To know something is what science comes from. But this was a system of knowing, and the Germans have a very strong notion of this, very, very crafty, almost techne. It's almost a craft to know. It's fun for them, right? In many ways, it's very processional. Hi, how are you? Yeah. If you don't mind, could you add your email to this and telephone number and grab a seat? Okay. Yeah. We'll make room. You want to come over here or behind or there or wherever you like. Okay. So anyway, this is done in the introduction. As I said, 1 through 71. The first 72 actually propositions. This is 73 through 89. Then Hegel divides the book, and this is interesting. Part A, Part B, Part C, and then an ending, right? So the Part A was devoted to consciousness in general, Bewusstsein in general, and in this consciousness in general, the section A, right? Consciousness in general. Once again, have the structure of self-certainty, the truth of self-certainty, right? Perception and deception, movement that goes on throughout, and force and understanding. And these are the 3 basic sections within section A, which is called consciousness, or the study of consciousness in general. So in a way, the consciousness is outside, very important to keep in mind that he is really describing consciousness in general through experiential categories as how do we come to self-certainty, how do we come to perceiving things, right? And then how does this deceive us in the logic of appearance? And then the relationship between force and understanding. I'm not going to go over it because, Sean and Josh had all this last semester. It'd just be tautological and repetitive for him. But what I can do is maybe in the next week or 2, I'm not sure, draw up a kind of elaborate synopsis of what we've done, to kind of get you going. So this might be a good way of introducing you, since we're beginning in, now we're going to part B, right? Right? And part B, and this is pages, this is only 38 to 104, and part B is only 105, right, to 137. So, or 138. So you can see There are only 33, 34 pages that are devoted to B, which is self-consciousness. And in this we have two major moments: the movement of self-consciousness, how that comes about, as well as what is called famously the master-slave dialectic, which is in history. And we're going to talk about that tonight a little bit, as well as the connection, as well as the connection for, the shapes of consciousness, which is very important. The three shapes of consciousness, ending in the unhappy consciousness, which is the transition to reason. And this is very important to remember, that you need the unhappy consciousness to begin the presupposition of a new category called reason. And in the German again, and sometimes I'll go to the German, it's a very powerful philosophical language, to put it mildly. Vernunften, Vernunften is very, very strong. The prefix in Nunften, reason, is an activity, reasoning. It's really a active movement. So basically, right here is part one of the phenomenology. We end with self-consciousness. Part two is the bulk of the writing. This is only about 100 and something pages, 137. Maybe a little longer. But the second part C, where reason is, that goes all the way through to revealed religion, is 339 pages. 3 times the amount that he devotes to our truth of self-certainty, perception, being deceived, force and understanding, and the movement of self, coming to consciousness of the self, as well as the master-slave dialectic in history, and then the shapes, historical shapes of consciousness, which again, the unhappy consciousness is the transitional moment. So I want you to please be aware of this, that most of the work done by the Marxian tradition, the epistemological tradition, is really involved with Hegel in section A on consciousness in general. Very interested in questions of perception, sense certainty, sense data, how we do things. Certainly the empirical tradition, and Hume, even though he didn't read Hegel, right, it was before Hegel, had that empirical thing that we can know nothing other than from the senses, the empirical tradition, etc. The primacy of perception, very active in the phenomenological movement, particularly in Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was a very, very active French, Marxist to a degree, and a thinker beyond Marxism, in my opinion. That's open to question, but a lot of people, he writes a great book called The Phenomenology of Perception. What is perception as a phenomenon? How do we come to the things themselves through perception, which is, in another phenomenological tradition, this is a crucial word, for Husserl, it does come down to the transcendental ego that perceives always. You're always in a process of perception, right? The perception leads you to the real. For Hegel, it deceives you, right? So they have a lot of epistemological questions are raised in here. So I'm just trying to give you how the tradition begins to work with this. Philosophers of science, since a lot of this is devoted to Newton, on force and the play of forces. I also think that Spinoza is very active there. However, there's very little written about that except by a French philosopher, Pierre Marcuse, Hegel or Spinoza. This section here is really about the philosophy of science. It's an encounter with Newton and the science of his day, right? So the philosophy of science people can become, within this book, I'm trying to stay in the book, but how it explodes in different tendencies among the scholars and the people that do Hegelian studies in Hegel, or do philosophy today, kind of read this book and where they go. So this philosophy of science, and this is where the Marxist tradition, one part of the Marxist tradition, again, locates itself, and this is with Alexander Kojève and probably Jean-Paul Sartre. They're the two major people here. And there's a man in France named Jean Val, who wrote a book on the unhappy consciousness. So you have a whole Marxist tradition that's very interested in not only the historical shapes of consciousness, you know, and you can see this play out in Hegel's lessons on the history of philosophy, which are worth reading. You know, it was written as a handbook in the 1820s for the students, right? That's what he did. And anyway, this notion of self-consciousness plays out very much because of the section which is called Lordship and Bondage, and we call it the master-slave dialectic, right? And this, to Alexander Kojève, picked up by Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis between the analyson and the analyst, you know, really plays out in history. And this has been rewritten now from the standpoint of the subaltern classes. So, for example, the Caribbean struggles since 1791 was the Santo Domingo slave uprising, you know, of Toussaint, right? Some people read Hegel in the relationship to Haiti in terms of an upsurge of Toussaint overcoming the master French and establishing the first, state in the Caribbean. You know, that is of the Dominican, Santo Domingo.
I believe that's where the merengue was invented.
Maybe.
And it was a way of ridiculing the upper classes.
It was a way of?
It was a way of ridiculing the upper class by
Yeah,
imitating them.
that's good.
Making them very stiff.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very good. No, that's very good. Yeah, very good. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there culturally that's going on. I mean, I do a lot of work on jazz, so I always think of jazz in terms of its, political and cultural context and what it's really trying to do against, class struggle or in, class relations. And how good that is, And the jazz world had two, Jewish multi-billionaire classes as their patrons. On the one hand, Rothschild, who was the patron to, Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk, yeah. Nico was her name, yeah. And she was the one who said, I want you to throw my ashes in the East River around midnight, after the song that Monk wrote that Miles Davis popularized and was sung. And Peggy Guggenheim was the lover of Art Blakey for a while, who also had the stable of abstract expressionist artists for a long time. So it's kind of interesting. You had two Jewish patrons, right, that were very, very active in terms of, the cultural upsurge of two extremely subversive forms in some ways, in different ways. Abstract expressionism to a degree, or Pollock and company were one thing, and on the other hand, Parker, Blakey, Monk, etc., Davis were another thing. So it's kind of interesting that you bring up the Moringa as a making fun of this. You also had a class in New Orleans too. I mean, I come from New Orleans, so I know a lot about this because there's Haitian migration and Cuban migration and the connection between Port-au-Prince and Havana in terms of music, and Congo Square was the beginning of really music in the United States, and Congo Square was the slave exchange. It was controlled by the Maspero family from France. It was known as the Maspero slave exchange. We got a restaurant closed during the 70s called Maspero's because they used the name of the slave auction for the name of the restaurant. And,
I recommend a movie to everybody, Burn.
Yeah, we know it. Yep.
You know it?
Come out. Yeah, with Marlon Brando and a cast of Cuban actors. Made in 1970 by Gillo Pontecorvo.
Yes.
Yeah, a great film about this.
And it closed in a week.
When it first came out, now it plays a little longer. Yeah. No, I love this film, and it's one of the greatest dialectically constructed films of all. Burn, 1970, and the Italian director Gillo Pontecorvo. He also did Battle of Algiers 4 years earlier. Yeah, did Battle of Algiers 1966, and 1970 was Burn, and then he did some films that never made it to the United States on Italian state terrorism during the 70s, during the roundup of the Autonomia groups, the Rosso Brigado, etc., but they never made it. They were not allowed in the United States. Yeah. I was in Baltimore when Realm of the Senses came out, which I don't consider subversive at all, but the censors were against it, and Lacan sent a letter to the Charles Street Theater that it should be shown to the Attorney General of the state of Maryland. It was kind of interesting. He made a very strong argument for why this should be shown, Realm of the Senses. So anyway, it was a very different period in the life. But yes, Gino Pontecorvo, Burn is a great film about this, about the master-slave dialectic, and probably the best filmic expression that I know of, although I think Friday night they're showing State of Siege, I think tomorrow night. Is that, I think the Marxist Educational Project at the People's Forum is showing State of Siege, which is a Costas Gravas film, a major film after Z, and it is about the kidnapping of a CIA operative in Bolivia and what happens under those circumstances. And the interrogation scene is also extremely beautifully done dialectically, the unfolding of the whole scene. It's a very beautiful passage, you know. So the European directors are onto this, you know, especially people. You know, another one I recommend, very dialectically constructed in terms of cinema, that period, is Miklos Jansko's Elektria, the myth and tragedy of Electra, in which Electra becomes a liberator of the people against her mother and her uncle, you know, and her mother's lover. Just an absolutely beautiful film.
Was it Miklos who?
Jansko, he's a Hungarian filmmaker, Jansco. Yeah. So anyway, I'm you know, riffing a little bit, but these are examples of the master-slave dialectic here. You know, I mean, going out, you know, on celluloid, which I think is always a very good teaching, and also an extraordinary, you know, powerful weapon that we still have at our disposal. I did not find, I saw Parasite, I did not find it especially dialectical. I thought it was very poetic, but it wasn't really that dialectical in its construction, you know, in a way. I don't know if you've seen Parasite, but this was South Korea.
Well, if it ran for the Academy Awards, you know.
Okay, right. Well, it may win a couple, I don't know. Yeah,
I mean, no, I mean, if it did run, how good could it be? If it ran for the Academy Awards, how good?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, it's very good in terms of parody. I mean, you know, really looking at a parody of the bourgeoisie. It's really more a Buñuelian film than it is out of the tradition of Pontecorvo, Costas Gravas, and what I would consider also the Latin American cinema of that time, Espinosa, Barbarossa, you know, Thomas Gutierrez Alea. It's a whole group of filmmakers that really tried to make dialectical films. I mean, meaning that they really understood this as well as they understood, you know, the unfolding of spheres, you know, in a very, you know, through the negative, through the power of the negative and the labor of the negative, and they were able to, you know, put together this work. So in the 70s, saw a lot of this stuff that came out. Godard made attempts at this, but in my opinion, there was a different kind of, you know, attempt going on. Maybe too much experimentation with language, but that's open to, you know, to question, you know, in many ways, right? Yeah. So anyway, and speaking of the socialism word, I will recommend. I mean, it's very interesting as a stimulating starting point on socialism, Film Socialism by Godard, of which the French philosopher Alain Badiou is in. There's an interview with Badiou on the boat.
On the cruise ship, yeah.
And on a cruise ship.
The Costa Concordia.
Yes.
The one that sunk.
Yes, the one that went sunk. That's right. Yeah. It's called Film Socialism, and the script is available too. Yeah. So anyway, to go back to this. So this is the first half, once again, of the book. And so we'll be going on next week, and I really want you to read it because, you know, I can't just, you know, talk, you know, to myself. I don't want to do that, right? Yeah, I want you to please, you know, for next week, you know, to read the section called Observing Reason, and this begins on page 139. The certainty and truth of reason. I'd like you to go all the way through the observation of nature. And why don't we go up to the law, which is, let's go all the way up to, 276, proposition 276, right? So that'll be observing reason, right? And as the certainty of consciousness that is all reality. And this is a discourse, if you will, to preface this. This is a discourse on idealism in the highest sense, right? In the highest sense of idealism.
Page
Yeah.
279?
No. Proposition 231, page 139 through page 166.
156?
I'll send out an email, but through page 166. Yeah.
166.
66, 139 to 166. So we'll get a beginning of reason, and I mean, right, about 27 pages. They're not easy, but it's about observing reason, about the powers of observation, right, first of all, and then, of course, observing nature. So we see this tension that begins to build between reason and nature. Okay, Natur and Vernunft. It plays out here. So, and again, we're going to talk today about the unhappy consciousness. So, anyway, and I'm very interested in some of my notes here. I have things like description of the bourgeoisie, in the margins and stuff. So I'm trying to reconstruct what I was thinking when I wrote these, annotations in the margins. So we'll try to go with that as well. Okay, so to go back to the Marxist tradition, so Kojève, Sartre are the two major representatives. Alexander Kojève, who gives lectures on Hegel from 1933 to 1939, and Sartre, who writes Being and Nothingness, a phenomenological ontology that has a lot of Hegel in it, right? Even though it's a phenomenological ontology, he's borrowing from Heidegger and Hegel to write this work. And you especially see the master-slave dialectic at work in concrete relations with others. Sartre has been a forgotten person, I think, badly so. It's kind of strange that he's been pushed aside so much by the Derridian, Foucaultian moment in France, even the Deleuzian moment, even though Deleuze loved Sartre and actually said Sartre opened up a way of writing for us. And I think that there's been a disservice to someone that was, an amazingly gifted steel trap dialectical mind.
And a great playwright.
And he was a great playwright and, illustrative of the philosophy.
Yes.
The no exit, the flies, condemned to Valtona, dirty hands, and all of these things were very real for that time. And a novelist, not a great novelist in Roads to Freedom, but certainly Nausea will stand the test of time as an experimental work. Yeah, I think, and that made his career. That allowed him to be, the privileged stipendiary of Gallimard. He didn't have to work. He just wrote, because of that. He quit his stupid job teaching in the lycée and became Jean-Paul Sartre. I mean, even though, during the war he was captive.
And he was a great activist.
He became a great activist later on, yes, that's right. And, these were people that really wanted to start movements. After 1948, Materialism and Revolution was a crucial text going into his study, as you probably know, Saint-Genet, where he studied Genet as a psychoanalytic object, and he also started, a radical democratic party outside the Communist Party. He was a fellow traveler, but he really tried to start a completely different kind of party in many ways. Yeah. So someone that's been forgotten, there's a lot of charges of sexism and all these things, but in another way, this was a massive dialectical mind that has not been really talked about much. There are Sartreans, there's a Sartrean society, but certainly not dominant in the academic institutions. And there are some good books. And Temps Moderne was his journal that he founded in 1945 that just closed down. Yeah, it had a long run. We have situations, 14 and a half years and all kinds of problems that they ran Temps Moderne for, nearly 70 70-something years after the war,
He
74 years.
also wrote a trilogy of novels called Les Chemins de la Liberté.
Yeah, I was saying the paths to freedom or the roads to freedom.
There were
Yeah.
3 in that.
Yeah.
I never-
Troubled
I
Sleep.
never read them.
Troubled Sleep, they're not that good. He tried to put the temporality of Einstein's relativity into the novelist form. So it's a very failed experiment.
One of them had a lugubrious title, La mort dans l'âme, Death in the Soul.
Death in the Soul,
That was,
right.
I don't know.
And no,
Why
yeah,
so
Troubled
negative?
Sleep. Troubled Sleep, I think, is how they translated that. Yeah, how that was translated. But yeah, I mean, a very gifted psychologist, as we know from the studies Genet. The Baudelaire is not good, but the Mallarmé is not especially good, but the Genet and the Flaubert studies are pretty amazing. Yeah, I mean, he did this
Yes, the
existential
Idiot.
psychoanalysis.
Was it The Idiot? The last 3?
The Family Idiot.
The Family Idiot.
That was the subtitle. The idiot of the family was Flaubert, Gaston Flaubert. It was called The Family Idiot. The author of Madame Bovary and Sentimental Education, which, Sentimental Education is basically the birth of modernity in terms of, novelistic form, right? This is how they dated. Roland Barthes and others are dating this way. So you have all this going on in the Hegelian aftermath. So, but I would like you to be aware, because everybody says, oh, we got to, do the Hegel in relation only to Marx. Well, yes, Courgette did a Hegel-Marx, right? A very subversive Hegel in 1933 to 39. And of course, Sartre, in the Critique of Dialect Reason, is using the Hegelian dialectic in order to, move along and understand what reason is, what reason really is. What is dialectical reason? So this is something we can pose. We're not going to figure it out, but at least we can open up the territory, right, in a way. So these are 2 major figures of that period. Now, when we get to the second part, to me, this is the way I read it, and this is me speaking. I'm not taking this from anybody. Anyway, that the part 2 of the phenomenology, reason and spirit and all of this, is a tradition that begins Lukács in the Western Marxist tradition. And Lukács is really very much attuned to the Hegelian reason, as is the Frankfurt School, etc. They don't really touch this part so much. They're going to go into this second, part, C, right? I mean, that's A, B, and then C, which I said was, 339 pages or so. But this is where they begin C, A, reason, right? And that's where they're thinking. So Marcuse writes a book, 1941, Reason and Revolution, right? Lukács writes a book, The Destruction of Reason, in the late 40s. All of this is based on Hegelian premises. Lukács' thesis is that Hegelian-Marxist reason has been dethroned or attacked from the beginning, from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche to Heidegger. Right? This is part of what goes on there, whereas in Marcuse' sense, reason in Hegel is really the reason of the state, and this is the beginning of modern social theory, of which is played out later by a woman who passed away. Her sister's still alive, Gillian Rose. Hegel against sociology, which is a very good thing, against positivism, against facts and accumulations of facts and all of that. So anyway, I want to point out this split, because this is what occurs, right? That you have another tradition in Western Marxism that takes up reason as the main theme that comes out of the Hegelian, phenomenology and the logic to a degree, but mostly out of the phenomenology, and then ultimately is taken up in the 20th century. So the Frankfurt School remains Hegelian in many ways, because of this, and Adorno's negative dialectics is really, a little bit about this, right? That we're engaged in the labor of the negative always, right? In order to get to the other side, so we can penetrate and break back into subjectivity in many ways. So this is another example of, how reason then plays out in history, etc. So, and science itself. Science proceeds by observation. Right? And observing reason is a very crucial section here. So you also have a tradition in the history of science and philosophy of science of people that take this up, including Paul Feyerabend, right, against method. It was against Hegel, and just says we'll go with intuition. It's a kind of a return to Kantian intuition that is blind without the concepts. And you begin to see all these kind of parameters playing off again the reason for the class. Hegel becomes a kind of landmark building block, for a lot of the thinking that goes on 19th century until today, in many ways. Now, I wanted to mention one other thing. There is a new translation that I understand is in advance. We're going to continue to use the Millers, since that's what people have bought and where we are. But it's by Terry Pinkard, who is a Hegelian scholar, and it's a Cambridge University text. And I looked at it. It is it's better, more readable than the Miller in some ways. It is an advance in readability, and Pinkard is very gifted at Hegel. He's a Hegel scholar at the university. I think he's in South Carolina. Wrote many good books on Hegel, including a biography that I recommend, Hegel, A Life, in which he talks about, I think I mentioned that Hölderlin, Beethoven, and Hegel were all born on the same day.
Same year.
Same year, I'm sorry.
Check that.
Yeah, okay, good, okay, yeah. Same year, 1770? Okay, all right, cool, okay, good, all right. So, yeah. So there's a very interesting chapter on Hegel and Beethoven. Good, it's good. I need to be checked sometimes. That's good. Yeah.
It's more
From
interesting.
birthday to year. No, I like this. This is good. Yeah. Good. All right. So maybe I should hear. Did you have a chance to look at any of this? Any questions? And I did for the people that just came in. I made copies of the. Let me see if I have enough here. I have Marcuse on the Dialectic. Let me just see if I have some more here. Maybe not. I thought I made it. Yeah, I did. Okay, I made enough. Yeah, and I have for you, you weren't here, the what is Enlightenment of Kant, where we began last year, right? In terms of the Kantian, and that's the Marcuse Note on Dialectic. And I think this is a very, very good place to really understand Hegelian dialectics. One of the most, descriptive and coherent attempts to look at what dialectics is, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to begin with that or if you want to go back to the Hegelian text, but this is very, very significant here in terms of giving you a lot of good insights into how dialectic works. Thank you. I don't know why they do this. They know they have classes. So. Yeah. I mean, they can't wait until we're finished. Yeah, anyway.
What's the title of the book, though?
The book is taken from Reason and Revolution, and you can see contents on the left side of the page. I recommend beautifully, it's a beautiful moment of really understanding 19th century positivism and what positivism is, which was what we live by in many ways. The section called The Foundations of Positivism and the Rise of Sociology, and especially that last section called The Transformation of the Dialectic into Sociology. I didn't make a copy of this, but it's in the book Reason and Revolution. The new book, Reason and Revolution, does not have the note on dialectic. This is from the 1960 edition that I got. Yeah, does not have it. I took this from the 1960 edition, in which he attached the preface, and it's the only time the note on dialectic appeared. Okay? So, anyway, we can take a look at it. You can see the end of Hegelianism. He's looking at what I put up on the board last time. The real is the rational, and the rational is the real. We're going to go back to that when we get into the section of reason, but he ends with National Socialism versus Hegel. So I recommend this as a very, very good book alongside. I mean, I just gave you a little part of it. I don't know if the PDF is available. It may be. But
it's called Reason?
Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Social Theory. And there's a new edition that is out there. This is taken, this note on dialectic, from the 1960 edition, and the original work was 1941. Yeah. And Olga's going to fact check me. 1941. I don't know the exact date, but anyway. Okay? All right. So, maybe a good starting point is to talk about this, since some of us are new here and that we always get confused by Hegelian moves. And this is a very good introduction, if you will, to the dialectic. I mean, I thought about this and said, how could we move forward, right, in a very positive way and get into process. And this might be a good lever to start with. It's up to you. I mean, we can read it carefully and do a commentary, and then we can go back to the section on the unhappy consciousness. Unless, Nathan, you had some questions about the section, the end of section A? On self-consciousness, or?
I think I stopped at proposition 191. That's the closest I got. So I wasn't able to get to the.
Oh, you didn't get to the shapes of consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I find it very interesting. I wrote a lot of notes on margins, but what comes in my mind at this moment is the intricate link between the form of negativity and the power of repetition of said negativity that sort of mobilizes and motivates and also sort of over-determines the movement of consciousness or self-consciousness. And I think the materiality of the two comes about through this repetition. I think that's what I have in mind right now. And I think what I would like to stress is the power of negation for Hegel is perhaps the power of the form of the negative. And what I usually care about when people talk about the transformation from consciousness to self-consciousness is the so-called mutual recognition. And I think that mutual recognition is only an intermediate stage of such a transformation.
Well, I agree with that. We can go back to that in terms of
That's
those
just what
stages. Yeah, I got it. But I mean, just going back to what you said about the repetition of negativity is in this. So maybe we can go to this. This is a good starting point to talk about that repetition, if you will, of negativity.
Yes.
And what Hegel and what Hegelians call the labor of the negative. Right.
Absolutely.
Okay? So anyway, so Marcuse is reading. I'll read some of it aloud. Maybe you can follow along, and then we'll ask questions and kind of hopefully explode it into the margins a little bit. This book was written in the hope it would make a small contribution to the revival, not of Hegel, but of a mental faculty which is in danger of being obliterated, the power of negative thinking. As Hegel defines it, thinking is indeed essentially the negation of that which is immediately before us. What does he mean by negation, which for Marcuse is the central category of the dialectic? Okay? Even Hegel's most abstract and metaphysical concepts are saturated with experience, and I've mentioned that too, that this is the science of the experience of consciousness was the first title, working title of the phenomenology of spirit. And it's something that people like Heidegger really emphasize. The science of the experience of consciousness as a Wissenschaft, right, of the Erfahrung of Bewusstsein. This is what he's really trying to do here, is prepare a science of the experience of consciousness. However, Marcuse is going to take a little bit of issue with this. Experience of a world where the unreasonable becomes reasonable, and as such determines the facts, in which unfreedom is the condition of freedom and war the guarantor of peace. This world contradicts itself. So first and foremost, we see the movement of one aspect of the dialectic, the law of contradiction. Right? This is absolutely necessary for movement, is the contradiction. Right? The world contradicts itself. Common sense and science, two enemies, right, purge themselves from this contradiction. But philosophical thought begins with a recognition that the facts do not correspond to the concepts imposed by common sense and scientific reason. In short, with the refusal to accept them. To the extent that these concepts disregard the fatal contradictions which make up reality, they abstract from the very process of reality. The negation which dialectic applies to them is not only a critique of conformist logic, or conformist logic, which denies the reality of contradiction, it is also a critique of the given state of affairs on its own grounds, on the established system of life, which denies its own promises and potentiality. So Marcuse gives us a very good introduction to this, what dialectic does in the beginning in Hegel. And what he's really counterposing here is the positivist, common sense tradition that takes up science and where we take sort of for granted. It wants to get us out of the common sense thinking, out of the ordinary thinking, right? This is a part of the issue always with doing philosophy, especially Kant and Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Husserl, and the rest, right, in many ways, to get us out of this ordinary way of thinking and out of common sense thinking. For example, Italian Hegelian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, begins the study of philosophy in his prison's notebooks with an attack on common sense. And common sense is one of the three elements, second element, of what he calls spontaneous philosophy. And in that case, that's always where the battle is taking place, where hegemony and the struggle of ideas is taking place. For Hegel, it's an encounter with and a move to the outside of this completely. The common sense thinking has no place in the Hegelian apparatus, if you will, in the thinking apparatus. So in some ways, you're relinquishing, right, your traditional ways of thinking, correlatively, commonly, all of these kind of things, very different notion of movement and the search for truth, if you will, or investigation of reality, probably better put. And for Hegel, the reality is not out there as an object. Another good German word, Wirklichkeit, which are the works of reality, the effects of reality, are being looked at. So it's a philosophy in effect, rather than a philosophy as a cause or a cause-effect relationship. It's very interesting in a way that we have this too. So we'll talk more about that when we get into reason. But any thoughts about this first paragraph? I mean, it's dense, I know, but I think it would really help us. I think it's one of the better, the reason I chose it, I think it's one of the best ways of engaging, dialectical thinking, is this note on dialectic.
It's a tool.
It's a tool, yes, exactly. Yeah. It could be the wrench. Yeah.
Well, it's not a tool, it's a process.
Yes, well, dialectics is a process. This is a pedagogical
Oh, okay.
tool. That's what you refer, I think referring to.
We need it.
Am I right? Right? Was I right about that? Yes. No, dialectic is always, and this is what we forget too, and we're very afraid of this, is, process. We're really afraid of this.
That's why Process and Reality is such a magnificent.
Yes, it's a very good book.
I forced myself to. It took me forever, and I didn't understand all of it. But I think that's why David Harvey, the original David, said that corresponds to Marx's philosophical conceptions more than, and that's what he said to me. I don't know.
Well, I mean, listen, that's another course or another discussion, but he's right in the sense that Whitehead's notion of process, and Marxist didn't read Whitehead, but Marx had a great sense of process, but he's getting it from Hegel, right? This processional movement is the Hegelian dialectic that's at stake.
That's why negation is.
It's not the Spinoza structural axiomatic dialectic. And we can talk about this more as we get into this, but I want you to first understand at least some of the terms of the Hegelian dialectic. And the first, listen, there are three basic elements to dialectics, right? The law of contradiction, which goes through formal, rational, and pragmatic forms, right? You have these kind of divisions. You have the transformation of quantity into quality, right? And of course you have, you know, the moment of determinate negation, right? In many ways, in the Hegelian dialectic, right? So, and the main law that the Marxists have taken up is the transformation of quantity into quality, right, in many ways, and contradiction. The capital itself is so full of contradictions that, you know, one needs to always live in those tensions and try to resolve them, think them through, right?
And what about
Hegel has a term called the tension of contradictions, living on the highway of despair and in the tension of contradictions, which is a nice metaphor.
What about the negation of the negation?
The negation of
That's
the
another
negation is
major-
also there too, yes, yes, we're gonna get to
Determinate
that.
negation.
Yeah, part of determinate negation too, right, right. Whereas in Spinoza, you just have determinate negation. With Hegel, there's another level to the determinate negation. Yeah, so but anyway, let's go over this again. As process, right? So this dialectical mode of thought is alien, and here we are today, right, to the whole established universe of discourse and action. And you know, the Soviet Marxist school, who are not mentioned here, Derov and others, are also, you know, participating in the worst form of vulgar dialectics during this period. So Marcuse has a double antagonist here. One is, of course, the American school of philosophy, pragmatism, positivism, etc., the academic philosophical community. And the other is the Soviet style of Marxism that's going on, and only it's Yankov and a few others that try to go beyond that, you know, in many ways. Yeah. So this is very important to keep in mind too, that there's a double movement, 1941 and in 1960. So he writes Reason and Revolution in 41, when, you know, it's pretty clear the Third Reich is still underway, right? And, you know, still has the power in you know, Western Europe and moving eastward. You know, obviously 1960, which is the advent of a kind of new Cold War, right? Yeah, in many ways. So he has, I mean, it's good to contextualize this. What are the stakes of the moment? I'm a firm believer in this. You can't read ahistorically or you know, outside. There are antagonists, there are many hidden elements here in that time period, right, that are going on. So, it seems to belong to the past and be rebutted by the achievements of technological civilization, dialectics. The established reality seems promising and productive enough to repel or absorb all the alternatives. So again, Marcuse, as early as 1960, is thinking through the great refusal of 1964, right? That he proposes at the end of One-Dimensional Man. Right? So this is another thing. And Eros and Civilization, he rewrites the political preface that the fight for politics is the fight for Eros, is the political fight. So anyway, thus acceptance or even affirmation of this reality appears to be the only reasonable methodological principle. Moreover, it precludes neither criticism nor change. On the contrary, insistence on the dynamic character of the status quo and the constant revolutions. We hear this all the time with data, you know, the new revolution in software, the new revolution. This is the way technology sells itself all the time, right? Apple's got a new revolutionary iPhone. You know, this revolution is going to take place in, you know, 5G. You know, we hear this constantly. This is going on today, as extended from the 60s. Back then, of course, it's a different promise. One of the strongest props for this attitude. Yet this dynamic seems to operate endlessly within the same framework of life, streamlining rather than the abolition or abolishing the domination of man. I like this phrase. Streamlining rather than abolishing the domination of man, both by man and by the products of his labor. Progress becomes quantitative and tends to delay indefinitely the turn from quantity to quality, that is the emergence of new modes of existence with new forms. And going back to what Nathan had said, you know, part of this dialectical movement is the production of new forms, you know, We call ourselves the Institute for the Radical Imagination. The radical imagination is interested in producing new forms dialectically. You know, how we can take what is living in debt in the tradition and transform it into new forms of both inquiry and at the same time the production of new forms in the world, right? And forms what I mean, you know, art, written texts, you know, etc. Yeah, what does it mean? And works of sublimation. Yeah, in a lot of ways. Okay, so yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah.
Just a very short comment. So the last thing is progress becomes quantitative, so this sort of, I think that today, it's from the late 80s and 90s of the 20th century, and especially today, I think in a very perverse way, it is true, we have, the material economy has already transformed from quantity to quality, not in the sense of a superseding the translation here of Cleveland, but it's this direct identification of quantity and quality. So where I get this idea is by reading of Baudrillard, where he basically makes the move that the sort of this vast quantity of commodity, their materialization is linked to the sort of logic of production. So he uses a metaphor of cloning. So cloning, in a sense, is that the principle of cloning is direct linked to the deployment of said principle. And another example he uses is AIDS. So AIDS, as well as information, it's not in the sense of those. I'm sorry. So basically, the distance between the deployment or the distribution of commodities and the production of commodities, the distance is collapsed.
Right. I mean, but I think Marcuse would say the same thing and is saying it earlier in a way where he's talking about, quantification, that the qualitative leap is no longer there, that the production of commodities becomes dominant. And in Baudrillard's case, the mirror of production is always working. That's what he's really trying to do. His early work is very interesting in this regard. He writes a book on the mirror of production.
Oh, yeah, I've read that.
Yeah. But anyway, but it's interesting from the standpoint of that the production, the just-in-time production, post-Fordism, in a way, has anticipated or is doing exactly what Marcuse says is happening, I think, to my mind. Just-in-time production, that you can write out your specs for the PC, right? You can get the Apple of your dreams, etc. You can do all this in terms of this kind of almost instant thing. Nothing is built anymore. So yes, the quantitative is immediately available. It almost becomes part of an earlier Hegelian moment of the immediacy of sense certainty, of the here and now, in a certain way. And because there's no reflection or dialectical reflection that's going on at that point. Yeah?
Yes.
So I think that's the important thing. But let's go on with this. So the power of negative thinking is the driving power of dialectical thought, used as a tool for analyzing the world of facts in terms of its internal inadequacy. I choose this vague and unscientific formulation in order to sharpen the contrast between dialectical and undialectical thinking. Inadequacies, of course, implies a value judgment. Dialectical thought invalidates the a priori opposition of value and fact by understanding all facts as stages of a single process. This is very interesting. A process in which subject and object are so joined, brought together, that truth can be determined only within the subject-object totality. All facts embody the knower as well as the doer. They continuously translate the past into the present. The objects thus contain subjectivity in their very structure. It's very, very interesting there. Yeah?
This is an incredibly important point that
Yeah.
Adorno goes into quite
Yeah.
explicitly, actually,
Yeah.
about how the object is more objective when you take into account its subjective qualities, ultimately.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
in the positivist moment, we only consider that this is black, it's plastic, not our experience of the
Right,
cup
right,
as it
right.
is.
Again, what Hegel's always doing, and what Marcuse is trying to show here, is that there are the suppositions of what we assume, right, what we take for granted, are all being pushed aside, right? Trying to get us out of this kind of facade of how we see things, right? And that, sometimes we bring together and agglomerate, like the impeachment hearings, positivism at work, right? Agglomeration of facts. This happened on this day, that happened on that day, etc. Nothing dialectical about it. Nothing at all. Part of the problem. If you go back and look at Watergate, Sam Irwin, even though he wasn't a Hegelian Marxist, is a sort of dialectical thinker. If you go back and look at some of the tapes during the Nixon impeachment, you get an idea of the decline in education of these people themselves. I mean, it's a very interesting study. I mean, it'd be a great book for someone in media studies to compare the Watergate hearings with this of the Trump, the trumped up Trump hearings, right, in some ways. It'd be very, very interesting to take a different take about this. How they just accumulate facts and try to show facts at work, and then they bring in all these strings. Basically what Marcuse is criticizing. It's very interesting, and how powerful this dialectical weapon really is when you begin to think through how we're conditioned to think, how the media presents things to us on a constant basis, and what he's saying, we have lost the power of negative thinking, in a way. Yeah. So let's get through as much as we can here. I think this is going to be rich, in terms of,
That's a very interesting thing about Sam Irwin.
Yeah.
Because I can't find, I think Adam Schiff is a good dialectical speaker too, don't you?
Well, I think the way they're going about it, to my mind, is not so much dialectical. I think it's really positivism and, the kind of worst brand of things. They're not really making connections. If they were really making connections, the charges would be much greater. In a lot of ways. So they would be thinking of a totality here in which they would be broadening, how did this quantity become quality? How did, this contradiction play out in other forms of the government? This is really an investigation into corruption, which is so much part and parcel of what's going on. And the great parody of this impeachment hearing was, we're very good at overthrowing dictators everywhere except in our own country. It was a great thing. It was a great little skit they had on, how is it that we overthrow dictators everywhere, but we can't do it in our own country? It's very, very interesting. Yeah. And what it's become is it's a he said, she said, back and forth in a certain way, which is really a playing with facts, right? Which is what the positives do. And then they try to agglomerate it, put it together in terms of a presented form that's appealing to the viewer or appealing to their other people there, but it's not really dialectical in terms of process if you look at this, to really think it through. Yeah, in many ways. Yeah, but anyway, let's go on. Now, what or who is the subjectivity constitutes the objective world? Hegel answers with a series of terms, and this should help us with the phenomenology a little bit. Thought, reason, spirit, and idea. Since we no longer have that fluent access to these concepts, which the 18th and 19th century still had, I shall try to sketch his conception in more fluent, familiar terms. Nothing is real, this is great, which does not sustain itself in existence. In life and death struggle with the situations and conditions of existence. The struggle may be blind or even unconscious, as in organic matter. It may be conscious and concerted, such as the struggle of mankind with its own conditions and with those of nature. Reality is the constantly renewed result of the process of existence. This is beautiful, right? Not just reality, the way someone says reality, constantly renewed result of the process of existence, the process, conscious or unconscious, in which that which is becomes other than itself. And identity is only the continuous negation of inadequate existence, the subject maintaining itself and being other than itself. Each reality, therefore, is a realization, a development of subjectivity. The latter comes to itself in history, where the development has a rational content. Hegel defines it as progress in the consciousness of freedom. This is the section we're looking at today, as well. This is a reference to section B, self-consciousness and consciousness of freedom, as you get to the later part, the movement from skepticism, stoicism, into the unhappy consciousness. What is that freedom of self-consciousness? Again, a value judgment, and this time a value judgment imposed on the world as a whole. But for freedom, and this is great, it's for Hegel an ontological category. It means not being a mere object, but the subject of one's existence. Not succumbing to external conditions, but transforming factuality into realization. This transformation is, according to Hegel, the energy of nature and history, the inner structure of all being. One may be tempted to scoff at this idea, but one should be aware of its implications. And we're going to see this next week in observing reason and observing nature, this interplay between the subject and nature, the interplay between reason and nature. Yeah. You want to say something?
I thought that freedom for Hegel was when your own values or your own subjectivity aligns with the state, essentially, with the needs of the institutions, essentially, in a sense, to a degree,
That's sort of part of the debate.
Okay.
I don't really agree with that.
Okay.
Again, Marcuse is beginning with the ontological premise.
Right. So
Right. So it's it's a question of being.
Rather than
first and foremost. It's not a question of the ontic dimension of the institutions or that of the sociality of reason.
Okay.
It's first and foremost stripped of its, veneer, or maybe how it plays out. So, sure.
Sartre said somewhere, which always struck me, man is condemned to be free.
Yes.
I don't know where he said that, but in the dialectic that I think we studied that once.
We did.
A long time ago.
Right. Anyway, Sartre's great insight is that, freedom is an incredible burden. If God is dead, then freedom becomes an incredible responsibility. It cannot be pushed off to providence, to a supernatural being, to a transcendent entity, a transcendental ego, or whatever. The onus becomes here, and that we're condemned to be free is really a very radical but a very frightening proposition, because then you become trapped in the Kantian categorical imperative. You're acting as if you're acting universally for all, always. So all of your actions are predicated on an ethical dimension for everybody. And, maybe why the appeal for Sanders. You're attracted to the ethical dimension of the man. He speaks about a different way, so to speak, or at least he's the only one out there speaking in an active way about certain things that are pretty self-evident to people that have been on the trail for a long time, right? But anyway, it plays out that way, in some ways. But yes, for Sartre, at bottom, we are, freedom. We are freedom. And this was his argument always with Freud, in a way. Yeah. Although he admitted later the existence of the unconscious and the pushing of that. But yes, we spontaneously, at our base, we are freedom. And the great battle cry in the play, The Condemned of Altona, Orestes says to, defying Orestes to Zeus, says, I am my freedom. That's what he did, announces. So instead of, I think, therefore I am, my subjectivity is my freedom. And Marcuse, by the way, I know late in life, and I know this for a fact, as a story, was very admiring of Sartre, even though in this he's going to talk a little bit about existentialism. He was not so fond of the existentialism of Sartre, but he was more fond of the critique of dialectical reason. He liked that kind of transformation of the subjectivity into the subject of history, right, in many ways, you know. Because as Marx says, we only know one science, and that science is history. That's the working premise of historical materialism. We only know one science, and that science is history. This is Karl Marx, German ideology, 1845, and continues, you know, throughout. That's the working premise of historical materialism. Yeah, how it goes out. But anyway, yeah, good. I mean, the freedom of Sartre is very interesting alongside of this, because it is Hegelian too, in a way, and the concrete relations with others is about the battles in relationships of who's struggling for whose freedom, right? Who's struggling against the freedom. And he sees relationships, Sartre does, I think narrowly at sometimes, in other ways, very realistic, that he sees relationships as struggles between two egos, two freedoms, and he and Simone de Beauvoir, they played this out. They made a pact of freedoms, right? This was what they did when they were in their 20s, you know, that lasted an entire lifetime. That they had the pact of freedom to do as they needed to do in certain times. So she could go off and have an affair with Nelson Algren or with her woman lovers, right? And Sartre, you know, would be able to, you know, do what he did, you know, and, you know, etc. And of course he gets the big blame, although Simone, you know, agreed to the Pact of Freedoms, etc. You know, and yeah.
Is there any truth to the business of 5 years they lived together, faithful spouses, and then 5 years they allowed each other to be free? I don't
Probably
I read that
gossip.
somewhere. Is that just
I think she.
tale?
Yeah, it's probably gossip. Yeah.
That's common sense.
The 5-year
Yeah.
plan. 5 years.
Olga was one of his lovers, by the way, a woman named Olga from the East, an actress, a lot of Olga, right, but anyway, that was one of his, and you know, he had his daughter, Arlette El-Qaim, the adopted daughter. I don't know if you know that story, but this was a man, in my opinion, who really lived his philosophy. Arlette El-Qaim was her name. She was doing her dissertation in Algeria on Sartre, and the committee was giving her a very rough time, saying she didn't really understand Sartre. So she writes him a letter and tells him what she's up to. He flies to Algeria and tells the committee, "You don't know shit about my work." Yeah, exactly. Gets passed, and then he adopts her as his daughter, and she took over the journal late on. But very militant. But then I'm not really sure what happened. I mean, I've heard again a lot of gossip, you know, about Arlette. But anyway, for a while they were very, very militant in the world, etc. Right? Yeah.
There are wonderful documentaries of their discussions, de Beauvoir and Sartre together.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, they spoke very quickly. She was rapid fire
Fast.
French, you know, like
She used to-
machine gun French.
She used to come to the interviews with a net over her curlers in her
Right.
hair. She didn't give a damn. Remember that?
Yes.
She was in her house
No, they-
with the curlers and
These were people that really, you know, flaunted their nonconformity, etc. But also were in the thick of almost every major movement of the middle
Yes.
of post-World War II upsurges. Big time,
They were.
big time. All the Panthers went to Sartre. All the militants went to Sartre, right? Even Charles de Gaulle, when they were trying to arrest him, you don't put Voltaire in jail, he said. You don't put Voltaire in jail. They tried to arrest him. So yeah, pretty magnificent life, whether you agree with his own philosophy or not. But for Sartre, again, going back to this question of freedom, you know, for him, he is the thinker of freedom in the world.
he also
Yeah, he
had
really is. I mean, you know, in the
wonderful
sense of,
attitude
yeah.
toward ugliness. He always felt that he was very ugly because he had a terrible walleye over here.
Yes, that's right.
And his writings are a perfect example of a non-materialism. How that the spirit is all that matters. He
Yeah.
was a wonderful man.
He hallucinated that he was a crab, I think. He took a lot of drugs in the 30s. A lot of mescaline, a lot of, well, certainly at the end of his life, a lot of amphetamines and alcohol. Of course, he smoked a lot. But yeah, I think he took major drugs over the years. I don't know about the, you know, And there's a famous story of when he met Charlie Parker in Paris, the saxophone player, and went up and said, I enjoyed your playing, Mr. Parker. And Charlie Parker turned and said, I've enjoyed your playing too, Mr. Parker. So that's a kind of a cool story of the philosopher meeting the great jazz musician, in a sense. And when he came to New York, all he wanted to do was go to 52nd Street and hear music, hear jazz.
And do what?
Go to 52nd Street and hear jazz. Yeah. I know a lot. I mean, I wrote, earlier on in Sarge when I was, doing graduate work. How can you not love the guy? I mean, in a sense. I mean, he basically, the Sinatra song did it his way, right? Without any kind of conformity, etc. So the freedom for Sartre is a style of Hegelian theory, but it's at the bottom. The freedom is at the bottom. It is an ontological principle in Sartre, because that's what we are essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Being is freedom, right? Being is freedom in the world. It's not the Heideggerian freedom of you let that space for things to let it be, to come into emergence. That's what freedom is for Heidegger in basic definitions. Or, the struggle for freedom, right, in the master-slave dialectic. For Sartre, we essentially are, in essence, if you will, in the en soi of the movement of the dialectic, the for itself and the in itself. In the in itself, we're freedom. And most people get stuck because they get very frightened of their freedom.
Right.
Because it's overburdening, it overwhelms them, and you see this in institutions, you see this in labor struggles. To me, this is really a very great starting point to get a movement going. Why are people so afraid of their freedom? Why do people choose their servility over their freedom, which is a question asked back in Labaquière in the 17th century. Yeah, an escape from freedom, like Eric Fromm said. Why do people continually escape from their freedom? What is that disavowal about? What ultimately is the denial, but really the disavowal, because everybody says they want to be free, but they don't want the burden, the activity, the labor that this requires. I think it's something worth thinking about, that's all I'm saying.
It was either Buñuel or, yes, about the last image is of a cart.
Right, I remember.
With the dog being pulled.
Right.
And it was, we are the dogs.
Yeah, well, he's a comedian, but he knows this stuff, yeah. His great dismantling of all movements was that obscure object of desire. One of his great films of the 70s. Really a great film about, revolutionary upsurges. It was during the Basque, movements in Spain that he's reflecting on in that. Anyway, let's go back to the text and see this at work. So again, process, right? Hegel defined the consciousness of freedom. The energy thing. Dialectical thought, page 9, top of the page, starts with the experience that the world is unfree. That is to say, man and nature exist in conditions of alienation. So we have the first premise of alienation here that's both in Rousseau, but even more pronounced in Hegel. We find ourselves alienated from nature, and we're going to see this working in section C next week, observing reason and observing nature, right? Exist as other than they are. Any mode of thought which excludes this contradiction from its logic is a faulty logic. And this is Marx too. The first premise of alienation in the economic and philosophical manuscripts is the alienation from nature. In some ways. So this is very, very crucial. Thought corresponds to reality only as it transforms reality by comprehending its contradictory structure. So you need understanding alongside the supersession. Because if you only supersede, or you're only transcending without the understanding, it's not doing you any good, right? And this is why he, goes through sections of understanding before going on to consciousness, and to self-consciousness. Hence, the principle of dialectic drives thought beyond the limits of philosophy. For to comprehend reality means to comprehend when things really are, and this in turn means rejecting their mere factuality. Rejection is the process of thought as well as that of action. And you can see here he's getting in the early stages, if you will, the thought, the seeds of the great refusal, which was Marcuse's political problem. I mean, political program and a problem ultimately, yeah, that came out. Right? Rejection is the process of thought as well as action, while the scientific method leads from the immediate experience of things to their mathematical logical structure. Philosophical thought leads from the immediate experience of existence, sorry about that, to the experience, to its historical structure, the principle of freedom. Yeah, let me just turn this off. Yeah, sorry. So, to its historical structure, which is the principle of freedom. So, freedom is the innermost dynamic of existence, and the very process of existence in an unfree world is the continuous negation of that which threatens freedom or denies freedom, threatens to deny freedom. Thus, freedom is essentially negative. This is interesting, right? You begin to think of this, and you know who's good at this stuff? When you read John Keats, Negative Capability, the negative theology movements pick up on this, the whole God is dead movement. They're very shrewd, these priests, the priestly class, you know, in picking up on this in terms of turning this into a negative theology.
Something called atheology, they put the
Yeah, the atheology is there, and the negative theology was a huge movement that came out of both Hegel and Heidegger in some ways. One was hermeneutical in terms of interpretive structure, and the other one was definitely a movement, processional movement, right? Right? Yeah, we don't care. God is dead. You can say it all you want. We're going to talk about negative capability at the base here. It's a very dialectical structure, you know. And, yeah.
I mean, what to me is essential
sure.
is this notion that you come to the limit. The freedom is your passing of this limit. How you pass the limit is through the moment of negativity.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we forget that too because we shy away from that negativity,
right?
In a sense, right? And again, we're very, very afraid of that freedom, the thing. I mean, I experience this every time I go into my university. I experience this. You know, that why is it that faculty, especially faculty that are tenured, can't rise up against a tyrannical and a very vicious administrative class that is basically ruining the university. They won't do it. All they care about is their pensions and their job security. They won't do it. They won't take that risk, and they wouldn't take the risk during the lockout. And this to me is a failure of nerve in the vernacular, but that really means failure of nerve is you're afraid of freedom. Yeah, you will not take that freedom upon yourself. You want security, right? It's tranquil, it's easy, right, etc. Right?
Then there's the herd. The herd instinct reinforces all that you're. No.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kant talks about this and where we began in the Age of Enlightenment. Yeah. Well, I did, but they don't read. That's part of the problem. Or they don't hear. You know, they may read, but they don't hear what's in the, you know, yeah. So, anyway, okay, so existence is both alienation, and this is good, because this is another thing we forget, that we're alienated subjects, right? We forget this. We don't want to be alienated. We want to be connected. We want to join in to something. We want to be a part of something immediately, so we forget our own alienation, right? And the process by which the subject comes to itself in comprehending and mastering alienation. So we have very little talk about alienation today. You know, Bernard Stiegler uses a great term, symbolic misery. This is what's going on in the world. That's his new term for alienation. What you should do. Bernard Stiegler is a modern French philosopher. Yeah. Someone that understands freedom. He had a jazz club. He was broke. He couldn't get the thing. He started to rob banks. He got caught robbing banks. He spent 4 or 5 years in prison. He made the most of it studying philosophy. And two major philosophers went to see him, and they started a degree program with him. And for 5 years, you know, when he got out, he was whisked through the Sorbonne and then became a major player. Now has his own institute at the Pompidou Center, very world famous in terms of thinking through technology, and extremely prolific. You know, a book a year, and a smart book a year, not just wrote books, you know, this kind of thing. Yeah, pretty amazing character. Yeah, but understands freedom very well. But he uses the term symbolic misery alongside the decadence of industrial societies. And he has a very interesting thing about alienation, that we have forgotten how to make things. I know you're a maker, so we have forgotten how to make things, so therefore we've forgotten how to live. The savoir-faire is lacking in technical civilization, so therefore we've also forgotten how to live. To go back to what you talk about, Baudrillard's simulation of quantity and quality merging in the production of commodities. Yeah.
What was Stigler's crime? Why was he?
He robbed banks.
Oh.
He had private property.
My kind of man.
There used to be a judge, Rabinowitz, in Detroit, and he used to distinguish between property crimes and crimes against humans, human crime. So anybody that came up to him on a property crime would get off, right? So, in Detroit. But if you went up and you had harmed another human being or something like that, you'd usually do some time. And he was known as, the Marxist judge, right? Because he was against private property relations, and he would not punish anybody for any kind of violation of private property.
What about white-collar crime, though?
White-collar crime? What about?
Yeah, like bankers committing fraud.
But what about? What do you mean?
So do bankers also get off for committing property?
No, they get slaps on the wrist. You see, Citibank's fined $800 million. Yeah, big deal. They write a check, and Jamie Dimon, goes his way. Yeah.
So the Marxist judge.
No, the whole thing about corruption is it's so built into the system. I mean, when someone says someone's corrupt, I mean, what else is new? That's how the system runs. Yeah. In a way. Yeah. It's very, very. That's part and parcel of the system. Yeah. The whole thing is. Yeah. Look at Joe Biden. I hope Joe Biden is not the nominee. I'm going to move to Canada if Joe Biden, is. Anyway. So Joe Biden is an example of someone who is favorable to predatory lending.
To what?
Predatory lending. He's favorable to the credit cards.
Oh, yeah. The state of Delaware has...
Yes. To me, that's a much bigger crime than robbing a bank. In fact, Bertolt Brecht used to say, it's more criminal to found a bank than to rob one. He said this. And then he was also amazed that there weren't more bank robberies during times of need. Like now, we're sitting here, thinking, oh, it's all corrupt, Trump. What a deflection,
His state of Delaware is a haven for insurance companies. Is that right? Is that what you're trying
Yeah, part of that, partially that. Yeah. So anyway, let's go back to this again. Alienation, which is something again forgotten as a term, right? Alienation, right? Entfremdung. You're estranged from nature, right? You're estranged from nature. It's a very powerful German word. You're defamiliarized from nature, alienated in the beginning. Yeah.
Where is that?
I'm on for the history of mankind. This means attainment of a state of the world in which the individual persists in inseparable harmony with the whole, and which the conditions and relationship of his world possesses no essential objectivity independent of the individual. As to the prospect of attaining such a state, overcoming alienation, Hegel is pessimistic. The element of reconciliation with the established state of affairs, so strong in his work, seems to a great extent due to this pessimism, or if one prefers, this realism. And he's speaking about the later Hegel, who becomes very much a state thinker, very much a state thinker as he grows older. In the phenomenology, he's still very radical in terms of the French Revolution, etc. But as things progressed, although you can read the philosophy of right as a handbook for the workers, it's a kind of manual for organization. That's his philosophy of the state, right, in a way. Anyway, so Hegel for Marcuse is pessimistic about this overcoming alienation. And at the same time, and this is anti-Rousseau, by the way. It's anti-Rousseau's, that eventually, man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. And in the state of nature, we were free for some reason, and then we gave up that freedom in order to form the social contract. And now we're guaranteed freedoms, but at what price? By the community, in a way. So you have to remember there's also a lot of, inner text going on here with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was very influential on the French, especially the work, the social contract in Emile. And Hegel, going back to this, and you know this, Diderot, Rameau's nephew, is really part and parcel of what this book is doing in terms of its narrative journey, right? Diderot, Diderot?
Yeah. Rameau's nephew has to do with the fact of how artists to survive have to not only be subservient and get their income from their masters, but they also at the same time have to be aware of that. Am I right? I don't know.
Yeah, and it's also a parody of the art world during that time, the salon and other things as well.
Patrons.
And the whole notion of the patron, right, and what happens during that time. Yeah. Hegel loved this novel. He loved the novel. Loved it. So anyway, let's go on. So freedom is relegated to the realm of pure thought. And this is where Marx and Feuerbach, Feuerbach's famous slogan about freedom is the recognition of necessity. This is Feuerbach following Hegel and trying to make material conditions back in versus that of just the thought of freedom. Okay? So Marcuse is very thoughtful here in terms of representing Hegel's idealism. And that really this goes on in the realm of thought, not so much in the realm of material conditions and material struggle. So Feuerbach's the first to reformulate freedom as the recognition of necessity. And then of course Marx, until the realm of necessity is passed through, can we talk about freedom? Marx takes that up in a very different way in the sections on surplus value, volume 3 of Capital, and elsewhere in his writings. So we're going to read this semester. We're going to hopefully have time to do some of the economic and philosophical manuscripts. So I'm emphasizing this dialectically too in terms of alienation, because this is where Marx begins with his analysis of the Hegelian dialectic, is with alienation. So, to the absolute idea, Hegel by default, Hegel shares his fate with the main philosophical tradition. So Hegel is ultimately an idealist, right? Certainly not a materialist when it comes to freedom, right? The first materialist vis-a-vis freedom is Feuerbach, Ludwig Feuerbach, yeah. Who was translated, by the way, into English by, what's her name? I'm not forgetting. One of the writers, the English writers, why am I forgetting her name? Not Godwin or Mary Shelley, someone else. It wasn't George Sand, it was someone else.
Did Feuerbach write, he wrote The Essence of Christianity?
Yes, and Principles for a Philosophy of the Future. Yeah, the thesis on the philosophy of the future, and he was the first of the sensuous materialist tradition, right? Very, very active in that way. Prosperity Marxism group has a kind of Feuerbachian tinge to it, if you will. There's a kind of sensuous materialism going on there too, when you use words like prosperity, etc. So dialectical thought, thus then, if you can kind of see his logic here, becomes negative in itself, right? In itself. Its function is to break down the self-assurance and self-contentment of common sense, to undermine the sinister confidence in the power and language of facts, to demonstrate that unfreedom is so much at the core of things that the development of their internal contradictions leads necessarily to qualitative change, right? So we're unfree, right? According to Hegel, according to Marcuse's reading of Hegel, right? Again, In Sartrean category, our bad faith is that unfreedom that we take up instead of the burden of the full responsibility of freedom. So in some ways they're on the same page, even though they go in different directions, you know. So the explosion and catastrophe of the established state of affairs. Hegel sees the task of knowledge as that of recognizing the world as reason by understanding, and we're going to go through this, you know, next week again when we begin the section on reason. It's reason by understanding all objects of thought as elements and aspects of a totality, which becomes a conscious world in the history of mankind. Dialectical analysis ultimately tends to become historical analysis, in which nature itself appears as part and stage in its own history and in the history of man. The progress of cognition, or knowing, from common sense to knowledge, arrives at a world which is negative in its very structure, because that which is real opposes and denies the potentialities inherent in itself, potentialities which themselves strive for realization. Reason is the negation of the negative. So this is where we're going to be in the phenomenology when we make the passage from the unhappy consciousness to religion. That's the transition where we're going to get reason as the negation of the negative. Right? This is what's going to go on. We're going to privilege reason at that moment. Interpretation of that which is in terms of that which is not, which is both Parmenidean and early dialectical thinking, the is and the is not, right? Confrontation of the given facts with that which they exclude. This has been the concern of philosophy, wherever philosophy was more than a matter of ideological justification or a mental exercise. The liberating function of negation in philosophical thought depends, and this is very important, upon the recognition that the negation is a positive act. So the stupidity in America when they say you're being negative, if you're really undergoing negation, is a very, very disheartening and, very fragile thing that goes on out there, right? People don't understand this because they have never been in that process, right? They think you're just being, quote, negative.
Difficult.
Yes, right. That's what happens. So if you're really in this process of negation, it is a liberating moment, but people don't understand this. They don't really understand this at all. The liberating function, right, the negatives, that which is repels that which is not, and in doing so repels its own real possibilities. Consequently, to express and define that which is on its own terms is to distort and to falsify reality. Reality is other and more than that codified in the logic and language of facts. Again, he's taking on the whole tradition of science, positivism. This is all going on. The entire educational system is going on. This is a man, and I think you wrote me about this, who said, education in America is a systematic moronization of its people.
I was quoting him.
Yeah. Well, that's Marcuse speaking. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I understand that it's a planned ignorance. I'm much nicer. I'm a nice guy. Marcuse was. Anyway, I'm just, yeah. Anyway, okay. So, consequently, to distort and falsify reality. Reality is more than, that codified in the logic and language fact. Here's the interlink between dialectical thought and the advent or effort of avant-garde literature. The effort to break the power of facts over the word. And this is interesting, to speak a language which is not the language of those who establish, enforce, and benefit from the facts. It's very subversive when you start thinking about this, And he's speaking to the theater of the absurd, to Brecht, to the living theater. All of these things are going on during this time. Julian Beck, Brecht is dead, but his plays are being produced, and there's a movement around this. Obviously, Beckett, Pinter, all very interesting in terms of word and absurdity, of these words that he's looking at. As the power of the given facts tend to become totalitarian, absorb all opposition, and this is what's going on today. I mean, I don't like the term totalitarian, but the way Marcuse uses it's fine to me, because what it does is it absorbs all the opposition, right? In many ways, yeah. Right. And to define the entire universe of discourse, the effort to speak the language of contradiction, right, appears increasingly irrational. How dare you point that out? Obscure, artificial. What are you talking about? You know, this is the things the replies you get. The question is not that of a direct or an indirect influence of Hegel on the genuine avant-garde, although this is evident, and we'll read some Mallarmé later, and Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, and Surrealism, and Brecht. Dialectic and poetic language meet, rather, on common ground. So you have a very interesting move here by Marcuse to the poetic, right? And to the theater, and to art in general, you know, and its subversive possibility. Marcuse defined the function of art is to subvert dominant consciousness, to subvert hegemony, right? What is hegemonic, you know, to be able to overturn that. He was against, and I'm really for this, art is just political statement. He really didn't see the problem, and you notice none of the social realists are here. He doesn't mention any of the social realists.
Brecht.
Well, I wouldn't really call Brecht a social realist, though.
Close.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he had an alienation effect.
Yeah.
Could
Yeah,
you explain
exactly.
that? Social realist, he doesn't mention.
Well, social realism is like the tradition that begins with, what's the name of the late 19th century? God, what am I forgetting the guy's name? Well, Eugene Sue, Mysteries of Paris, going into Zola. Emile Zola would be a social realist.
Okay.
The Mexican muralist painters are social realists. You know, these are the kind of things that become, you know, in the American
And the
context,
Soviet Union.
Alice Neal, and then of course in the Soviet Union, during the Stalinist period, socialist realism was dominant, right? There was no, quote, avant-garde, you know, it was only social.
I like it myself.
No, I'm not saying anything
No, I mean,
against it.
in this
I'm just saying that,
in this
you know, for-
capitalist culture, people tend to say it's simplistic and it's conformist. That you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do. Well, it's
I hear
okay.
so
Yeah, well,
much
I know the old
negative
argument.
putting it down. I think it's great.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's not the only thing, but I think it's great.
Well, I mean, the debate, if you want to really go into this more and more, is really between Lukács and Adorno and Benjamin. You know, this is really where the debate starts, you know, in the Marxist tradition. You know, they begin to debate this. So for Adorno, you're not really hearing just because you're listening to Stravinsky. You have to listen to Schoenberg, Berg, and Weber to really hear. And then some of the Dmitry Shostakovich during the Stalinist era. And you have to hear differently, you know, et cetera. So the 12-tone row system, you know, opens up a whole new possibility of hearing and listening that cannot be recoded by capitalism, right? In a sense, right? So, yeah, go ahead. I mean, yeah.
Here's just a little experiment.
Talk a little louder.
I'm sorry. So I was just mumbling. So I see there may be a parallel between the opposition between avant-garde and socialist realism, and also between Hegel in phenomenology and Hegel in the philosophy of rights. So in a way, perhaps there is what one might call infinite judgment, where one makes the claim that avant-garde is socialist realism, or Hegel's phenomenology. The logical consequence of Hegel's phenomenology is so-called conservative thought in the elements of the philosophy of rights. That maybe another way to put it is that this is an absurd claim. Unfreedom is freedom.
Well, he says that in that.
Yeah, he's saying that. I mean, you know,
Yeah,
Marcuse's, I mean, Marcuse's point here is to get back to the authentic language, right? This is where he's really going here. The common element in the search for an authentic language, the language of negation as the great refusal, The argument against social realism is that it stayed at the level of statement and proposition about something and never really went beyond to create that new language of subversion.
Right.
And therefore could be brought back into the capitalist enterprise, even though it did raise awareness, right, in some way. So it had a function of negation, but not the function of negation that Marcuse is looking for, in which you're creating a more authentic language, right?
Yeah, I would say that's a theme of negation rather than a structural negation ultimately.
Yeah, okay.
But what if you know the key socialist realist art itself is the disillusionment of the fantasy that there is always some other possibility out there, that there is always something more, that favors a certain kind of a creative skepticism, whereas socialist realism or Hegel's lesser logic as a sort of universal manual, as opposed to his very creative work in phenomenology. In a way, it's a sort of a sacrifice of, or in a way, it's a sort of negation of the negative itself. So it's a sort of sacrifice in a way. So again, it's a horrible thought that this very creative, dynamic movement comes to its very, very opposite. So
right. I mean, the real issue here is what cannot be dedoubled or doubled in the system. That's really the argument around the avant-garde. What can no longer be doubled or representational thinking, right? That's really the argument against socialist realism. It can be doubled back into the capitalist, right? Everybody knows the dice are loaded. Everybody knows old Joe still picking cotton. That's Leonard Cohen's social realism. That is a doubling that goes back and forth, right? Whereas if you look at Bob Dylan, when he does Desolation Row, it's a much more subversive thing, which he takes from Desolation Angels, of the On the Road, right, of Jack Kerouac, the Desolation Angels of the Beats, right, and talks about Einstein was famous long ago. Now he plays violin on Desolation Row. There are many, many elements there that make people think differently in a different kind of language, right? Than it's just oppression and oppressor. It has to do with distortions of temporality. So you can ask the question, is Faulkner, in terms of his experiments of time, and I'm not trying to argue against social realism, I mean, I think it has its place, but you look at Faulkner's experiments in time, or Proust's experiments in time, in the novel, right? And is that better than reading, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, or The Jungle of Upton Sinclair, or these kind of social realist works, right?
That serves
about
the
things.
purpose, though.
Yes, exactly. Yes, but I mean, that's what I'm saying. But again, that subversion of temporality, again, opens up new possibilities that I think you were alluding to, that are more dynamic, right? In some ways, that don't keep you static within the same old series of statements or propositions.
Mao's
In other
Cultural
words,
Revolution advocated, didn't it, social realism?
well, he had a form of socialist realism, collective art, I mean, they had, I've seen
That's
some of
another
that.
good
I was in San
example.
Francisco in the late
Wow.
70s, and I saw some of that magnificent stuff, the collective art,
Never seen it.
But it was a celebration of harvest, it was a celebration of, I mean, these were celebratory works, right? Much like the Soviet art of of the 30s, and the poster art. Some of that stuff's magnificent. I have many books. Josh has seen a couple of my books. You have some of those books. On the Soviet avant-garde of
The posters especially.
and the poster art. Yeah.
Well, I
The
think-
brothers Sternberg. Yeah.
I mean, what you were saying about the temporality, I think, is
Right.
exactly right, because
Right.
it's almost like you're almost being forced to sort of make these changes or to identify that space of negativity rather than just sort of following along, on this superficially ultimately.
Yeah, to my mind, this is a long argument that goes back to Bergson in terms of temporality and even Hegel. Is time space? Or is time something different? Is capitalism really in control of time and temporality, right? Does a Faulkner, a Proust, these experiments with time, Joyce and Ulysses, who sets the 20-year journey of Odysseus in one day in the life of a Dubliner, right? Leopold Bloom, right? In a sense, are these experiments in a way much more subversive than just the pure statements about spatial relations and capital? I think this is one way of approaching it. And what is is there this where duration, durée, time and space becomes active in social realism, right? And then there's another question of time that could be more subversive, right? In terms of maybe even where Adorno's going in terms of the temporality of the new music, right? That Stravinsky is still traditional in terms of the rites of spring, or what he done, etc. He has this argument, with Stravinsky and others. So I think it's complicated, but if we take it from the standpoint of spatial temporal relationships and how space and time, we begin to maybe see what an avant-garde does. I mean, Beckett minimizes everything. Adorno, it's not an accident he loves Endgame. He thinks Endgame is the highest expression of where bourgeois thought goes. Ham and Clove. After the nuclear war, I don't know if you know the play, but it's for Adorno. This is the end moment of the theater, the end game.
Fin de partie. I think that's how you say it in French.
Yeah, in French. Yeah, he wrote it in French. Yeah, then it came to be an end game.
End of game, literally.
Yeah, end of the game. Yeah, end of the game. Yeah. So anyway, so these are interesting moments. Where do you put Beckett? In a way, yes, there's a social realism there, obviously, but at the same time, there's an experiment with language that is distorting the temporality to the point of where we no longer think in linear or even in concentric ways, right? So this is another thing that we, should consider. Yeah.
There's another play you wrote called Crap/Tape.
Yeah,
which is very weird.
Yeah, it's a wonderful.
I don't think I ever read it, but I may have read about it.
Yeah, no, he's a great artist and also someone that was part of the resistance.
You mentioned the Flaubert. I read this book, The Light in August. Did you ever read that?
Well, that's Faulkner.
Faulkner, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
And what he does there is get into the psychology of a black man running for a crime he didn't commit. He did commit a crime.
Right.
But you get into what it's like to be fleeing, always running.
Right.
And the psychology of it goes along with, like Flaubert, describing nature at the same time as he goes along.
Right, and Faulkner also in Sound and Fury, where the first 50 pages are through the mind of an idiot trying to hit a golf ball.
That's really great.
Right, I mean, pretty amazing. The first 50 pages, the experiment with temporality through language that's going on through the mind of an idiot, Benji, who's a Compson, right, of the Compsons, and then you get into the story of Caddy and her brother Jason and Quentin. A very interesting family saga, but it distorts the temporality. Yeah, well, a truly great writer. Another one that, we don't really read on the left in an active way or really think through, but incredibly subversive, in his way.
My brother was a writer, he was a lyricist, did well.
Right.
He couldn't bear many things of great literature. And so we were split in that sense. And he represents America to me, my brother. And, yeah, he really does. He is
successful writer,
until
the ghosts of
Hoboken.
He's a writer.
Right.
My brother was. He would love to have written songs for Sinatra. He loved the ballad. Yeah. But he couldn't stand Frankie Avalon songs. That I agree with. He loved Larry Hart. Larry Hart. Those kind of lyrics. But he fell for everything that the system put out. He fell for everything, God, country, and family, and everything else.
Right.
And no subversiveness in him at all.
Right.
Nor his children, nor anybody in my family.
Right.
So. And when I recommended Faulkner, he read about a page and said, "This is trash."
Yeah, well,
This is, but, you know, and.
actually, the Nobel Prize speech, speaking of trash, was thrown into the trash, by the way.
He was?
And then he reminded himself of it and gave the speech. He really didn't believe a word of that mankind will survive when he received the prize. Yeah, this is a true story. He confided in someone who's published this, after the fact. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I only brought up an
Yeah,
because it's
no, I
sort of
understand.
universal.
Yeah, good. Let me just say a couple of things. They're going to kick us out in a second. So let's look at this: the great refusal to accept the rules of a game in which the dice are loaded. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Why would we say the absent must be made present? Because the greater part of the truth is in that which is absent. And he goes through Mallarmé, I say a flower, and out of the oblivion where my voice banishes all contours, musically rises, different from every known blossom, the one absent from all bouquets, idea itself, and delicate.
It's magnificent,
Yeah.
even though it's
Right.
murky.
Yes, indeed. In the authentic language, the word is not the expression of a thing, but rather the absence of this thing. Very interesting, no? And you have the absence cause in Althusser. Here, you can begin to see how theory plays out. Lacan's lack,
Right.
right? Many of these things are playing out here that are coming out of this poetics of symbolic and aristocratic poetry of the 19th century, post-Hegelian universe. The world makes the things disappear and imposes upon us the feeling of a universal want and even of its own want. Poetry is thus the power to deny the things, the power which Hegel claims paradoxically for all authentic thought. In short, thought is the labor, right? That which brings to life in us that which does not exist. He asked the rhetorical question, what are we without the help of that which does not exist? This is not existentialism, it is something much more vital and more desperate. The effort to contradict a reality in which all logic and all speech are false to the extent that they are part of a mutilated whole. The vocabulary and grammar and language of contradiction are still those of the game, there are no others. But the concepts codified in the language of the game are redefined by relating them to their determinate negation. This term, which denotes the governing principle of dialectical thought, can be explained only in a textual interpretation of Hegel's logic. It must suffice to emphasize, by virtue of this principle, the dialectical contradiction is distinguished from all pseudo and crackpot opposition, beatnik and hipsterism. The negation is determined if it refers the established state of affairs to the basic factors and forces which makes for its destructiveness as well as for the possible alternatives beyond the status quo. In the human reality, there are human historical factors and forces, and the determinate negation is ultimately, and this is crucial, a political negation. Right? As such, it may well find authentic expression in non-political language, and the more so as the entire dimension of politics becomes an integral part of the status quo. And this is what's happening to us today. The language of politics is within the realm of the status quo. The politics of the alternative, of the refusal, is not out there. People don't want to talk about that, right? They don't want to bring these things into play, right? Even in the Sanders campaign, I know people like Cornell and Adolph Reed are very bright people who work with him, but they're not getting through. They're radicals. So dialectical logic, and I'm going to end here because I know they're going to kick us out in a second. Dialectical logic, it's critical logic. It reveals modes and contents of thought which transcend the codified pattern, use, and validation. So he's really saying we've got to go over this language that has become not only cliche, but codified in our usage to get back, like he uses Mallarmé and Paul Valéry, to the authentic use of language, right? In many ways. And this is what the avant-garde is doing, in a way. The minimalism of a Beckett wants to force us to think. How do we use words? What are we using the words for? How are we, actually communicating? Are we really communicating? One of the great movies of all time, in my opinion, is Robert Altman's Nashville. You know, nobody is communicating with anybody. It's a great political film. It should be seen every year, you know, when you have an election, right? It's a great film, especially the last 6-7 minutes when the shooting takes place and she keeps singing. Ronnie Blakely, I think is her name. Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful film. Absolutely wonderful on the non-communication of communication in political thought.
Is this what Foucault's great work? I can't understand it. Les mots et les choses.
Words and
is this
things,
related? Yeah. Words and things. How words try to express things, but more often than not.
Well, he was going against, I mean, listen, these become sophisticated theories in linguistic theory, the resemblance theory of language. Right? Can things correspond one-to-one in terms of object and thought? And no, is what, you know, a dialectician would say.
Yeah.
No, we're against the correspondence theory of truth, right? We're against that kind of logic. That's positivism at work. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting work. It's a structuralist work.
Well, the order of
Right.
things. That's
Right.
another title of it.
Yeah, it's translated as the order of things. Yeah. But words and things is the French literal
I find it very
translation.
terse and dense and.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Have
Yeah, it's
to
a hard
read
book
and
to go
reread
through.
to under.
Yeah.
For me, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's taking up a whole position in the history of structural linguistics. I mean, Saussure, you know, that presupposes a background, if you will. And again, this is the problem in the graduate programs and in, you know, over-specialized knowledge. People aren't reading the pretext to these books, so they get lost in the theory of what someone's saying. Whereas if you know something of Saussurean linguistics, you're able to see this at work in Foucault and how he's appropriating it. And this is the reason why you should have, you know, very integral core, you know, classes. You know, I mean, you don't need much more than the Cratylus of Plato, you know, a couple of books on Aristotle and rhetoric and the Poetics, and, you know, a couple of other treatises, you know, on language, and, you know, you're pretty much there in a way. Yeah, right? Yeah, with words and things, right? If you can read between the lines and you have an imagination. So, yeah. So this to me becomes a problem out there. But we can go back to, but Foucault is anti-Hegelian. He's Hegelian but anti-Hegelian at the same time. You know, he's a student of another great Hegelian, Jean Hippolyte, you know, who was really his master in that time. So anyway, if you could read the rest of this, and then we'll do the pages on reason for next time. And I'll send out an email now that I have everybody's email here about the reading, etc. And I'll try my best. I don't know if I'll have it in a week. We'll go ahead in 2 weeks and you know, to send out a summary of maybe what we did last semester and, you know, get you somewhat up to speed. Yeah. So,
Thanks,
and
Michael.
we'll pick up again at, you know, why don't we start with the independence and dependence, you know, go through that a little bit into the unhappy consciousness for half of the class and then go on to reason.
Yeah,
So you're
I think that would be good.
acclimated, right?
It's a
So you
nice
get the
section.
transition going, right?
Michael, what?
But at least this is a good introduction, once again, to dialectical thinking. And if you can read this carefully, read it again, you know, in a sense, I think it's going to really help in the reading of Hegel. You know, to see this permanent negation at work and all that. Yeah.
Two classes.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to, this week,